Okay. Oh, people keep coming, so I'm just going to give it I'll give it a half a minute more. How's that? Okay. Well, we've got 57 people. I think I can start now. Okay. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar, which is co-sponsored by Mass Peace Action and more specifically the Peace and Climate Working Group has been working on this, and 350 Mass. And tonight I'm wearing both hats, which so as I'm a member of both 350 and Mass Peace Action. So, well, the focus of tonight's webinar is Chevron's destruction of part of the Ecuadorian Amazon and the subsequent lawsuit brought by Steven Donziger on behalf of 30,000 indigenous people and farmers, and resulting in Chevron's multi-year persecution of Donziger. It's important to remember that this could be any powerful industry, including the military-industrial complex, e-commerce, tech, and more, co-opting the judicial system. Capitalism, with its need for ever-increasing growth, greed, and resultant concentration of power, has led to the wanton destruction of those least able to defend themselves. All of this in service of profit and power. If you know anything about Mass Peace Action and 350 Mass, you know social justice, equity, and the right to a just transition to a climate-safe world are among the core values. And after I'm done with this, I will drop links to both organizations in the chat if you'd like to find out more. For tonight's program, we were originally scheduled to interview Steven Donziger. Instead, as of October 27th, he has been in prison in Danbury, Connecticut. With the close timing, no one on his team was able to be here. So Zoe Stevenson, a Mass Peace Action intern with a strong interest in this case, has put together a presentation detailing it. Zoe is a third-year student at Northeastern University, majoring in environmental studies. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A moderated by Amar Ahmed, who is a staff member with Mass Peace Action. And please use the raise hand function, or you can drop your question into the chat and Amar will call on you. And before we begin, I just want to say that it's been a great experience and pleasure working with you both, Zoe and Amar, and hope I get to do it again. And thank you, Cole Harrison's the executive director of Mass Peace Action, for your support and technical help. So take it away, Zoe.
Thank you, Diane. Hi, everybody. Like Diane said, my name is Zoe. I am an intern here at Mass Peace Action, and I was originally supposed to be the one interviewing Steven Donziger. So when he was unfortunately arrested, I sort of took over, and we're just going to have a little bit of a presentation on what I learned in the research I did as we were leading up to the interview. So I'm just an intern. Obviously, there are probably going to be gaps here in what I can give you. So we're going to provide some resources, but not only for what you can do, but also where you can get more information if this sparks an interest in you in the case, which we certainly hope it will. So I'm going to begin a slideshow at this point. Okay. So like Diane said, I This presentation is going to go more or less in chronological order, starting in roughly the 1960s and leading up to present day. But I wanted to sort of address the elephant in the room first and not leave this to last. So like Diane said, on October 27th, Donziger did report to jail. He is going to be in prison in Danbury, Connecticut for the next 6 months, for as far as we can tell. So obviously he unfortunately cannot be here with us tonight. This picture on the screen is one that he tweeted of him saying goodbye to his son, who is a teenager right now. And you can see his caption on the screen. So this was obviously very heartbreaking for their family. And I also wanted to point out that Amnesty International and the United Nations have both spoken out against this as arbitrary detention. And so from here on out, I'm going to sort of give a history of how he ended up in this situation and what's been happening with this case. So this all began in 1964 when the company Texaco began drilling in Ecuador. And the area that they were drilling in is called Lago Agrio. It is home to a list of different indigenous peoples that you can see on the screen. And I'm going to have Amar put in the chat as well a map where you can go and actually see where each of these different peoples live within the region that Texaco was drilling. And while they were there, they did produce a lot of oil, 1.5 billion barrels, and they made about $20 billion in profits from this. So this was a very productive oil area with lots of indigenous people living there in 1964. And this drilling was not only happening in that year, but it continued all the way up until 1990. So this is how much they produced during that period. While they were there drilling, they also did a lot of polluting, intentionally dumping around 18 billion gallons of toxic wastewater into the environment, and also spilling about 17 million gallons accidentally. We're going to see a picture of an open air waste pit, which is a typical way that they would be dumping this waste into the environment, but they also did things like spread this waste on the roads to keep dust down because none of the roads were paved. So just sort of wantonly disposing of this in the Amazon. And by doing this, they saved about $3 per barrel, so made about a $4.5 billion worth of extra profit by not taking these environmental protection measures that they should have been taking. Not only that they would have taken now, but a quote I came upon in my research was they had tarps back then too. So measures they absolutely could have been taking at the time and were not. And if you're familiar with the Exxon Valdez spill, which was obviously a horrible disaster, this spill and dumping is actually about 30 times larger than that. So this is considered the biggest environmental catastrophe as far as oil spill on the planet to date. So here's that picture, like I promised, of an open air waste pit. These are unlined. There's waste obviously seeping through the water system if you have an unlined pit like this. And there's about 1,000 of them in this region of Ecuador. And the big problem with these, besides just being disgusting, is that they're really terrible for the local inhabitants. And cancer rates in these areas are about 47 times higher than we think they should be in these areas where Texaco operated. It is also estimated that 10,000 locals will contract cancer in the upcoming years, next couple of years. And that's really a very large number. This is a disproportionate number of people getting cancer. There are also things like miscarriages and skin conditions that are just really rampant in these areas as a result of this oil pollution that is just everywhere. So I brought you into 1990 at this point, but Texaco actually left in 1992, 2 years later. And when they left, they handed the oil drilling operations over to Petro Ecuador, which is a state-run oil company. And this will be important later, that handoff. In 1993 is the case against Texaco began. So Donziger had been sent to Ecuador on a trip, and when he got back, they asked him to join this case with 2 other lawyers. He had only been out of Harvard Law School for 2 years, so he was very green as a lawyer at this point, but he took up this class action lawsuit in New York where Texaco's headquarters were located on behalf of, like Diane said, 30,000 farmers and indigenous people, so a huge group, over this contamination and the destruction that Texaco had committed to the environment in these areas. Texaco made this long argument over the course of 9 years that this case actually belonged in Ecuador. I suppose that sort of makes sense. The pollution happened in Ecuador, the plaintiffs were in Ecuador, but Donziger and his team argued that the Ecuador court was not equipped to handle such a large case involving an American corporation. So they went back and forth about this. Texaco thought Ecuador would be a more favorable place for them to have the case because they had allies there, allies in the government, and they had sort of a powerful stronghold there. So they thought the court would be friendlier to them. That was their reason for wanting to switch over. And eventually the New York court agreed and said, okay, this case does belong in Ecuador, and so it had to move. During those 9 years when they were battling over where to have this trial, Texaco was sort of covering its tracks. So it spent $40 million cleaning up sites. The picture that you see on the screen right now is a cleaned up site that was formerly one of those open air oil pits that Texaco came in and dumped a whole bunch of dirt on and then told local farmers and indigenous people, this is safe now, we have remediated it, you're welcome to build homes on these areas. So that is what the people did. They built homes on these newly covered waste pits. And this was obviously not good for the people. Oil started seeping up through the dirt, which is what you see happening in this photo. So the oil wasn't gone just because it was covered up, to the surprise of no one. And after Texaco did all this remediating, they then signed an agreement with the Ecuadorian government that's basically, they would claim, eliminated them from having any liability for the pollution. Basically saying, we've cleaned it up, we're in the clear, you can't come at us anymore if this becomes an issue in the future. So this is an excerpt I'm about to show. It's the trailer from a documentary that was made about the case once the case had moved to Ecuador. So again, this is a trailer. It's sort of more promoting the documentary itself, but it does have some really good footage. You'll be able to see that oil waste being spread onto a road and also just get to see some of the indigenous people themselves discussing what they are experiencing. And we'll also be giving out the link to watch this documentary if you choose to watch it in the future. I'm going to make sure you can all hear me.
What was once paradise now has just been left in destruction.
The total area in which Texaco polluted is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. We are suing for environmental cleanup.
The plaintiff's accusation is defamatory and not true. It's just false and wrong.
Es que hoy decenas de hombres y mujeres están padeciendo cáncer y están muriendo en la actualidad.
Chevron takes those kinds of allegations very seriously. There's absolutely no evidence that there's an increase in cancer.
Chevron is fighting the claim and the men who they say have made up their story for their own financial gain.
The analysis of our water and soil samples are proving that they're guilty of massive contamination.
Esto no es contaminación. Esto es una explotación industrial permitida por la ley.
So we're going down to have a little chat with the judge today. This is something you would never do in the United States. But Ecuador, you know, this is how the game is played. It's dirty.
Usted es un abogado corrupto. Usted es un abogado corrupto de Texaco.
People are fed up with corruption. They're fed up with foreign oil companies. They just had it.
Where is her cancer? In the liver. But these people have been systematically poisoned.
We've sampled every stream, and it has nothing to do with oil. It has to do with poor sanitation.
This is about some of the most marginalized people on Earth. Fighting one of the most powerful companies in the world.
Texaco hizo cualquier barbaridad de cosas. Texaco responde por lo de él.
When you look at the science, they cannot really prove their case.
In fact, we're having a trial. It's a miracle. It's a huge victory.
All right. So now that that little clip has sort of gotten us started, I just want to talk a little bit about the case in Ecuador once it was moved. So you got to see a little bit of footage from that case being fought at the time in 2011. So Chevron's argument, or Texaco's argument, I think I might have missed that. Chevron bought Texaco in 2001, and that is why they are now sort of used interchangeably. When Chevron bought Texaco, it said, we are accepting responsibility for anything that this company may have done in the past. And so that is why they become, as of 2001, Chevron rather than Texaco. So at this point in 2011, Chevron is making the argument in court that Petroecuador is actually who's at fault for the pollution, that state-run oil company that took over once Texaco left in 1992. Chevron is also citing the $40 million cleanup that it engaged in while all of that arguing was happening about whether this case belonged in Ecuador or in New York, and the ensuing 1998 agreement with Ecuador that Chevron says released it from any liability going into the future. They also claim that Donziger and his team only took on this case to gain wealth for themselves and not for the sake of the indigenous people. But in the end, the Ecuador court, even though this had been moved to Chevron's playing field of choice, even though they had this agreement, the court still ruled in favor of Donziger and his team and agreed with all the scientific evidence that they were seeing that Texaco, now Chevron, had done huge damage to the environment and should now pay. So they ordered Chevron to pay $9 billion to the people of Ecuador and also publicly apologize for the harm that they had caused. And there was a threat that if Chevron was unable or unwilling to apologize within 15 days, that the amount they were going to have to pay would double. And they did not, in fact, apologize. So it was doubled after the 15 days to 18 billion. Chevron appealed this ruling to the Ecuador Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the decision, but did reduce it back down to that $9 billion. So you'll see both of these sort of reference both of these two numbers. Whether the figure was 18 billion or 9 billion, either way, it fell short of what an outside expert said would be a reasonable sum of money to engage in this cleanup, which was the $27 billion that you saw in that little clip from the documentary. So that is what they're expected to realistically owe versus what they were being fined for was that $9 billion to pay to the people of Ecuador. Chevron's response can be summed up pretty well in this quote, which is quoted a lot from a former counsel of Chevron, which was, we're going to fight this until hell freezes over, and then we'll fight it on the ice. So they had absolutely no interest in backing down from this, in just settling. Typically, companies will just settle when something like this happens, but Chevron was absolutely not doing that and kept pushing forward. So Chevron's response was to completely pull all of its assets out of Ecuador, basically sell everything and leave so that the ruling could no longer be enforced in that country. Donziger and his team in response tried to collect in other countries where Texaco was operating, where Chevron was operating. So Argentina, Brazil, and Canada. They were unsuccessful or have been unsuccessful thus far at getting Ecuador to pay, but the courts of Canada did agree that this was a valid ruling that should be paid. They just did not enforce it in their own country because Chevron no longer has assets there either. So this is becoming an international case. Chevron is hiring lawyers all over the world to fight Donziger and his team, again, on multiple fronts in multiple countries. While that fight is going on, Chevron files a racketeering suit against Donziger and his team in New York. And this suit is a really interesting choice because it's usually used against mobsters, hence my little mobster cartoon there. It's not typically used against human rights lawyers, so this was kind of an interesting situation. And the arguments that Chevron was making against Donziger is that that he and his team conspired with Cabrera, who was the outside expert that established that $27 billion figure, and also that Donziger and his team tried to bribe the Ecuadorian judge and secretly wrote or ghost wrote the judge's decision against Chevron, so that it was actually Donziger, his words, his team's words, that was just signed by the judge and put out as legitimate. They did not actually try to argue that they weren't responsible for the contamination. This was just about how the case was handled. Donziger and his team responded by claiming that nothing they did was wrong. Nothing they did was outside of the norm for Ecuador. So you heard him saying in that video, you wouldn't be able to do some of this stuff in the US, but according to him and his team, this is exactly how things go in that country. And this is exactly how Chevron was operating in that country as well. The arguments that I think are most convincing against Chevron in this case are that even if Donziger and his team were acting inappropriately with Cabrera, Cabrera's findings were not actually included in the actual judgment because this came up really early. So the court heard all about Donziger and his team's relationship with this outside expert and decided not to use that evidence just because it was too contentious. So this part had already been solved. About the second part, about them bribing and ghostwriting the decision, the biggest evidence for that was the testimony of Alberto Guerra, who was a corrupt Ecuadorian ex-judge who was removed from the bench for accepting bribes. And he testified that he was the one who was bribed to ghostwrite on this case, to write Donziger's words and then give them to the presiding judge to sign. This witness is very contentious because he was being paid by Chevron, and this is sort of common knowledge. They were openly doing this. They paid him at least $326,000 for his testimony. This is a really conservative number. On Donziger's Twitter, he claims it was closer to 2 million. So I've seen very wide-ranging numbers on this. They did also provide him with a vehicle and immigration assistance. At the time that they approached him, he was very poor and he was struggling. He wanted to bring his children to the US, but he could not afford to. So Chevron would have provided him the resources to be able to do that. They also rehearsed with him for 53 individual days in a hotel room. We know that they met for those days before the trial. And he later, after the trial, admitted that he lied under oath. He admitted that he lied and embellished. He admitted this to another court. So that is obviously very concerning, and no one has heard this evidence since, that this particular witness was obviously quite untrustworthy. And in case you were wondering, it is illegal to provide compensation to someone to testify. Whether or not you are doing it to influence their testimony, it is still illegal either way. So this payment was a crime on Chevron's part in its own right. The other really concerning thing about this RICO suit is the judge that was presiding over it. So the judge that was presiding was a former lawyer for a tobacco company named Judge Louis Kaplan, and he's known to be really sympathetic to large corporations. He's the one who actually approached Chevron in the beginning and said, hey, you should file this RICO suit, usually used against mobsters. And then once they decided to do it, he assigned it to himself. He was also had investments in Chevron that he did not disclose during the hearings. He, through some minor technicalities, did not actually need to, but it's very concerning that he didn't in a case like this where his ability to fairly judge the trial had already been called into question, and he still did not bring that up. So lots of lawyers and judges have said that is very unethical conduct. He also made really disparaging comments towards the Ecuadorian plaintiffs during the case. So he called them so-called plaintiffs. He also referred to the entire trial in Ecuador as a game and equated it to mud wrestling. So obviously insulting to these people who have been working so hard to try to get justice. Another concerning thing about this is that right before the trial happened, Chevron decided to drop all of the financial claims it had against Donziger, which allowed them to drop a jury trial. Had they kept those financial claims, they would have had to have a jury, but they dropped them at the last minute so that Judge Kaplan could make this decision single-handedly and would not need a jury. So there was no jury trial in this case. Judge Kaplan alone decided that Donziger and his team were guilty of this fraud that the sketchy witness had said that they were guilty of, and this meant, among other things, that they could not collect in the US. It also had some implications for how Donziger could or could not profit off of the case in Ecuador. But I think the fact that they couldn't get justice in the US was a really important outcome of this. And Kaplan didn't stop there, even after he won the RICO suit against Donziger. So after he won, or yeah, I suppose you could say he won. A judge shouldn't be winning, but after he won this case, he ordered Donziger to turn over his cell phone and his computer to Chevron. And Donziger refused to do that. He refused to do that while he appealed. He was in the middle of an appeals process to see if he really did have to turn this stuff over. And the reason he cited was attorney-client privilege. So he said there was sensitive information about his Ecuadorian clients on his laptop, and he did not want to give that over to Chevron, and he should not have to. And while this appeals process was going and Donziger was refusing to turn over his own items, Judge Kaplan charged him with criminal contempt of court. So now he has this charge for holding on to his own laptop. And when Kaplan asked the New York prosecutor's office to prosecute him for this, the prosecutor's office basically told him he was being ridiculous and they were not going to take up this case. At which point, Kaplan took an unprecedented step of appointing a private law firm, Stewart and Kissel, to prosecute Donziger privately when New York would not do it. He also handpicked the judge who would preside over the case, and her name is Loretta Preska. She is concerning because she is on the advisory board of the Federalist Society, of which Chevron is a large donor. It is a right-wing lobbying group. Stewart and Kissel is also a really concerning choice for someone to prosecute Donziger because they represented Chevron as recently as 2008. So both of these different aspects of the case have Chevron ties. I'll also throw in there, like I did on the slide, that Preska has a history of pro-corporate rulings. Even if she was not directly tied to Chevron, she would have been a really logical Chevron pick as a judge just because of her voting history. So she is now taking up this case, as is Stewart and Kissel, and they're going to prosecute Donziger for criminal contempt. While they are working on that case, they put Donziger on house arrest pending his trial. And then his trial is delayed and delayed and delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So he ends up on house arrest for over 800 days. If you do out the math, that comes out to around 2 years, over 2 years, which seems really ridiculous when you consider that the maximum sentence for his misdemeanor contempt charge is 6 months. So he spent like 4 times the amount of time on house arrest that he would have needed to spend in jail, even if he was convicted, had the trial happened. He was forced to wear an ankle monitor everywhere he went, which he referred to as the Black Claw. You see that cited a lot in various interviews with him. And while he was on house arrest, he was also disbarred, so he can no longer practice law in New York. He can no longer make a living that way. He and others on his team believe that the person who got him disbarred was Judge Kaplan, although that is not released information, so they don't know that for sure. Some other evidence that this is really unprecedented confinement is that no other New York lawyer has ever served more than 90 days of home confinement for this offense, and he served way more than 90 days. And no lawyer without a criminal record has ever been held pre-trial for a misdemeanor. So he shouldn't have really been held pre-trial anyways, and even if he had been post-trial and on house arrest, he wouldn't have needed to serve more than 90 days in any other case. So this seems really excessive. He finally got his day in court last month in October 2021, and this trial did not seem fair to him or his team. Judge Preska denied his request for a jury. So once again, this is the second time he has tried without a jury, just with a Chevron alive judge and no one else. He was also denied streaming for the trial. He has a lot of support in his community and from his university and from lots of different places. And these people wanted to be able to see what was going on, and the judge said no. The judge was also cited as reading a newspaper during the proceedings, so being really disinterested, not paying any attention. And Donziger called the whole thing a charade. Before he was actually convicted, I read an interview where he had said that they had basically given up on winning this and they were just going to try for a really strong appeal. And they did not want to even add legitimacy to something that just seemed so ridiculous. But even though all this was going on, unsurprisingly, he was convicted of the 6 counts of criminal contempt, and he was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison, which, like I said before, is the maximum. But he is not allowed to just get off on time served. He has already served way more than this in under house arrest. Judge Preska said that would not count. He has to actually go to jail and serve another 6 months of time. Steven Donziger did say that he was going to appeal this. He had 2 weeks to get it appealed before he had to go to jail. And what he is saying is that she is trying to get him to serve all of his time, all 6 months, before the appellate court, the Court of Appeals, can even hear the case and even make a decision, because it is such a short sentence and he was forced to go into jail so quickly. So this is where we end up where we were at the beginning. This is the exact same slide. Donziger was recently He recently reported to jail. He is now serving the sentence. He is working on his appeal. We have this photo again of him saying goodbye to his son. So now we're going to talk about what you can do. I believe Amar is going to put some resources in the chat. What I haven't talked about in a lot of this presentation is that in addition to stripping him of his career, Chevron has also been able to obtain lots and lots of fines on Donziger for their legal fees and things like that. So these are things like donations, but also on top of that, writing letters of support, or even just keeping up to date with what's going on following the case. I would recommend following him on Twitter. It was an unexpected wealth of information for me when I was doing this research. So I'll let Amar and Diane take it away for what they recommend. But yes, going to provide some resources for what you can do to help him right now while he is in jail, and really shouldn't be.
Amar's dropping in a couple of links. One is to the number to call Attorney General Garland and ask him and the DOJ to step in and intervene in this case, especially since Amnesty International and the UN human rights have called for, which is unprecedented, that actually the UN called out against the US and said he should be freed immediately. They made a statement, what they called an urgent statement. And there's also a petition to sign that's been going around. There's a number of petitions, but this one is specifically from the Free Donziger website.
Yeah, and while these resources are going around, we do have time for a Q&A period. Diane and I are going to, and possibly Amar as well, answer questions to the best of our ability, but really just trying to foster a discussion about this. We know this isn't really the formal webinar sort of structure that people are used to, so we're here to discuss if people are interested.
Right, great, thanks Zoe and Diane. So yes, if people have any questions, for Zoe, Diane, they could put their questions in the chat and we can read it out, or they can use their raise hand feature, as I see Michael Hoey is doing right now, and we can call on them to ask their question directly. So yes, Michael.
And you can make a comment too. Sorry, I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been following this thing in Ecuador for, I don't know, 20 or so years. And the only thing that I really have to comment is that it's kind of systemic. It's not that unique. Anywhere where oil is taken out of the ground, there are similar violations. And it seems like, based on what I'm understanding, that's part of what the free trade agreements are all about. So generally speaking, if a right-wing government goes in, they sign contracts. And then once they're voted out of power, the government that's either center or left has to honor those contracts. Otherwise, we have troops in there to encourage them to honor the contracts. And so I understand lifting up the Ecuadorian situation. I'm really glad we're lifting it up, but it just seems like this is the kind of thing we're going to run into over and over again as we start to open our eyes, is the way the world's being run for the benefit of the people that are extracting oil and natural gas.
I totally agree with you. And I think that, yes, this is part of, I mean, you see the Chevron and other major corporations have got in with many of the Central American and South American countries and have their footprints all over. And they do have, like you mentioned, they do have contracts that they sign. And it's pretty disgusting. And you're right. I think this is highlighted because the case against Donziger, but it is going on all over the world. And it's going on, one thing I'd like to point out, it's going on with gas and oil extraction, but it's also going on with other things like war and bombing, the war in Yemen, and what happened in Afghanistan. So it's like you said, it's systemic to, in my view, to the capitalistic society that we live in.
Yeah, I would say when I was researching for this interview that was upcoming, if you just search like Chevron pollution, you're going to get so many countries where this is happening. And I think one of the important things about this case is it does set an example for anyone who might try to fight against Chevron or any other corporation of the like, that this is how you'll be treated. And so that's why it's kind of up to us to stand up and say, like, that's not okay. We won't let our people be treated like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a scare tactic, and it's a very powerful scare tactic. And, you know, you can see it in lots of different areas, but definitely, yeah, it's saying, you know, to human rights attorneys, do you want to risk your living? You know, being disbarred is a lot of consequences for a misdemeanor.
Yeah, that's right. And what I shared once with the Peace and Climate group was that the fact that Chevron's taking such a bad PR hit, but continues to go forward with this, it must mean, I think, that what Donziger did was effective. So it was a threat to them. Yeah. So we have a question, Zoe and Diane, from Anne, and she's asking, I read that Judge Kaplan is now trying to sue the indigenous people who were affected by this pollution. Is this true?
I haven't, Zoe.
I can take this. I'm not sure if this is quite what you're referring to, but I have been following Donziger's Twitter pretty closely, and there were tweets coming up today about Chevron now asking the indigenous people to pay for their legal fees. Yeah. That is obviously a huge sum for an indigenous community or for anyone, given how many resources they have put into this case. So that may be what you're referring to. As far as Kaplan specifically trying to sue them, I'm not quite sure the details of that. But yeah, they are definitely coming under fire for a large sum of money right now. And I believe Donziger also said in the tweet that they had sort of waited for him to be in jail, waited for this timing to now bring all this stuff up.
Okay, so we have a comment here. Catherine is saying, it seems to me that this is a case, if lost, that could affect the process of suing any large corporation and its lawyers and their supporters. Do either of you have a comment on, the potential, I guess, precedent this whole situation could set?
I could say, I think it can set a really huge precedent. And I think that, I don't know the legal aspects if it can set. I assume that part of it can set a precedent. I don't understand how they're actually, why the DOJ hasn't stepped in and removed Preska and, Kaplan and disbarred them. And that to me is the reach of big fossil fuel companies. But I think one way it can set a precedent is that it can scare people. It doesn't even have to be a legal precedent. It can really scare people. You really have to think about, do I want to risk my whole life being ruined? And my guess is there's going to be a number of people who don't feel, not because they're not good, but don't feel that they actually can. Donziger, he's not a saint or anything, but he has given up a lot and he's continued his fight for the Ecuadorian people. So,
yeah, I would echo what Diane said and say that the social precedent, capacity for social precedent is huge. And then as far as legal precedent, I think the big concern is the idea of Kaplan appointing a private prosecutor and hand selecting a judge. That is not common practice. That is against the local rules for how you operate a trial. So the fact that those things are able to happen is very concerning, I think, to a lot of people as far as legal precedent.
Yeah, right. Okay, and so Zoe, I saw you address this in the chat, but if you just want to repeat this verbally a little bit. Vicky's asking, when did Chevron first go in and how long did they stay?
Yeah, they first arrived in 1964 and they left in 1992. So they were there for a very long time.
And so after 92 is when I guess the state company took over. Is that right?
Yeah, that is when they handed over operations to Petro Ecuador, the state-run oil company. I believe at Ecuador's request.
Okay, great. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions or hands raised. Yeah, no, I'm not seeing anything else. So unless anyone has any final okay, we have a question from Lynn. We have a couple questions here. Lynn, can you unmute, please?
So you look all of 17 years old. What are you in reality?
I get that a lot. I do look young. I am a third year in college. So I'm not 17. I am an adult.
So you're 18, 20 or something.
I'm turning 21 soon, but yes, I'm 20.
So is this going to be your practice? Are you getting into law or into social justice? Which
yeah, I would say my interest is more in social justice at this point, but I have definitely considered law.
It's just an interesting play to be in if you're in law, you know, like it's kind of makes a bad name for law, this whole situation.
I would agree.
Yeah, sorry.
Folks that like you. Joan's gonna, or Joe. Joe or Joe?
Okay, yes, Joe, yes.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It goes to show me how powerful these corporations are, and that our criminal justice system is so corrupt with this jury stacking, and it's just unbelievable. Thank you for this.
Yeah, of course. And thank you to everyone else who worked on this as well, and to everyone for being here.
I missed the first half. I'm sorry about that. I had a kidney stone today. So
oh
no. So meantime, you know what this reminded me of is the Kathy Kelly was speaking on the issue of that fire, what do you call that? Hellfire missile that went into that Afghan family doing social justice work. And that thing comes down with like razor blades that twist and just Cuisinart everything, and it's like so gruesome. And the fact that I didn't associate, I knew Daniel Hale was doing something good, but he was the one who reported that, and he's got 4 years as a result. So it's like, oh, thank goodness for folks like that. Because, you know, I mean, they were doing social justice, they were moving water, you know, and they were scanned for like a week with drones and stuff. So, but even, you know, what this made me think of is even if we get the technology that we can, you know, zone down on a millimeter from, you know, way above, it's still there. You make so many enemies. That family in Afghanistan, oh my God, you know, how many terrorists are going to come down generations later from that family? You know, the real terrorist is us. And I'm ashamed to be part of this country that we do this kind of stuff.
Thanks, Lynn, for those comments. So let's take a question from Joan, and then we'll take a question from Cole. Joan, can we ask you to unmute, please?
Yes. We're at a unique moment right now. Here we are having the COP26, where they are proposing absurd solutions to try to address climate change. One like net zero, which is an absolute scam, and then also the investment company, environmental, and what is it called now? Environmental social governance, which is absolutely a stupid thing. And what they are doing is, what is happening in the US is they're denigrating the legal system. He went through the proper channels, and this is it's just absolute. I can't believe it. This is the way it should be done against the oil companies. You go into court and they're charged, the proper process is followed. But look what's happening. They're talking right now in Glasgow about absurd solutions when the legal solution would be an appropriate one. And there's another legal solution that could take place too. If only the US was no longer withdrew from the International Court of Justice, an excellent case could be there before the International Court of Justice, using the fact that the U.S. and many of the fossil fuel countries are in violation of Article 2 of the legally binding framework, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I mean, what he is doing, what he has done over the years is risk everything to show that the law is powerful, and we've got to respect the rule of law. And what's happening now, it's just absolutely incredible that he should be put in jail while we have people there, all these scams over there. There are 500 people that have accreditation over there that are linked to the fossil fuel companies. I mean, I think there might be some way of addressing this issue during the COP26.
I don't think, I think it's a, great linking to that, because what's happening at the COP26 is that a number of companies that are affiliated with fossil fuel, either by being fossil fuel companies or ensuring them, invested in them, are actually sponsoring, which to me is an oxymoron. Fossil fuel companies are sponsoring a big conference, the Conference of Parties, which they say is the last great hope, are sponsoring this environmental conference. And so what you're hearing come out of it is, really inhibited by who's sponsoring it. And that's part of, this whole system, and part of what I worry about with, climate, military, that the big companies are going to get in there and kind of take over. And that is what happened. I mean, there's more fossil fuel related companies and groups allowed in the blue zone, as I call it, or is it the green zone, whichever it is, in COP26 than youth activists. It's interesting, Greta Thunberg wasn't asked to speak this year, and I think that's actually a sign of her power and of what is happening, because they're afraid. And I think that's why Chevron's doing this to Donziger. They're afraid, and they want to make sure they scare enough people and silence them.
And another thing, if I may, another thing that's happening is the developing countries are being penalized, because at the conference, this has been in for some time, something that the North has always advocated, that we must agree to consensus. Well, what ends up happening? I was at many COP conferences, and I can remember when all the developing countries in 2009 and COP15 were absolutely against whatever was coming out. They were against 2-degree rise, but one after another was saying, no, we can't do this. They were very dramatic as well. Tuvalu said, I'm not going to sell out my country for 30 pieces of silver, that sort of thing. And so then what happened was, rather than the chairs saying, well, let's see if there's a fallback of 75%. Obviously, there's no consensus. So instead, the gavel went down. We have an agreement, and completely leaving out all the developing countries. So this is just absolutely, I just can't believe it. And for someone to be sitting in jail, someone who is going through the proper process, this is just the most ironic and deceitful. I don't know. Thank you so much for having this. And you were wonderful. Yes, you should definitely go into law. Yeah. So,
Thanks, Joan, for those comments. I think so many of us agree with your sentiments. So let's take 2 more questions, I think, and then we'll get ready to close off tonight's program. So Cole is asking, let me find this here. Cole is asking, what is the overall public response to Chevron Kaplan's attacks on Donziger?
Or to put it another way, who's winning the PR war over this?
Yeah, as far as winning, maybe it's just sort of my bias and what I see, but I can confidently say that Donziger has a lot of support from the environmental community and also just from the community at large. This could have been anyone that had chosen to take up this fight. So I think he does have a lot of sympathy. And I think a lot of people are getting really fed up with corporations like Chevron treating people this way. So if I had to say, I would say that Donziger is winning this PR war.
Yeah, I have a little different take on it. I think it depends on who you're asking. I think, people interested in human rights, environmental activists, peace activists are totally siding with Donziger and, like I said, Amnesty and the UN. But if you look at large corporations, my guess is they eventually will try using some of those tactics. So they're finding a way. So for them, Chevron's winning. So it depends.
I will add that part of Chevron's criticism of Donziger was that he did use PR tactics in Ecuador, that he was rallying public support. And that is one of the things that they said was inappropriate, that he was doing outside of the courtroom, as if there are not massive PR campaigns for these fossil fuel companies. So yeah, there's definitely PR happening on both sides. And Donziger has a background in journalism as well. So some of that does come directly from him.
I wonder if I can point, Zoe, you were fantastic. This was a fabulous meeting, but to see how really critical this is, the New York Times business section had an article on yesterday, 8 November, attacking Donziger. And the headline is the lawyer who stood up to Chevron, a hero or an outlaw? It's a disgusting article, which makes it so clear why we need to be who we are and organize. And, I think one thing we're getting from the COP meeting is to save the planet. We really have to end militarism and weaponry and stop the use of oil, gas, and so on. So this is so important. Zoe, your presentation was totally brilliant. Go on, power to power. Thank you, everybody.
That article, we all read it yesterday, and I wrote a little bit of an email back. I was pretty pissed because that article was disgusting. It was disgusting, and they didn't present. It was totally one-sided, and it was not factually accurate. But they didn't present anything on the opposite side. But then I thought it's
it's what?
New York Times. What?
New York Times business section.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will reiterate that we all read the article, and we were definitely discussing that this was a perfect example of the importance of the grassroots and why we're here. Definitely just adding fuel to the fire with that. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, and thank you.
And I'd just like to say one thing, that when you just said about people power, one of the things that COP, and there's something called cop26.tv, and it runs all day, so I've been watching a lot of that. And one of the things they keep saying, and that I keep saying, is that it's not what's happening inside the COP that's going to matter, it's what's happening outside. It's the activists. It's up to us. To me, it's time to forget what's going on in there, because they're not going to do anything. We have to do it.
Yes. Okay.
One last thing I wanted to say, Amar. If you get kidney stones, go to the urologist. If you feel urgency, go to the urologist, not to the ER. It's $18,000 for 2 hours. It's like, this is what this country's about.
Thanks, Lynn. Okay, I see we have a hand raised from 847 number. So let's take one last question for the night.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my question. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm calling from Chicago. My question is there equivalent of a clean, here we have the Clean Water Act, so we can fight it on that, we can fight water contamination on that level. Do they have the equivalent of the Clean Water Act down in Ecuador?
I do not know the answer to that question. I do know one of the many fingers Chevron pointed was towards Ecuador's environmental regulations, saying this is the government's fault, they should have had better regulations, and then we would have followed them. They were not even following basic environmental practices, so we can infer that that is not true. But I do not know the state of their regulations at this point. I'm sure they are different than they were in 1964, I would hope. Yeah, I do not have an answer to that. I'm sorry.
I have to say that I don't know the answer to that either, but I will say that even though we have environmental regulations here in the US, look at line 3 and what they're doing in Minnesota. They're not exactly following any of the regulations that we have. So enforcement is part of the problem.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
They do
Thank you for
have
that
the right to
question.
nature, the Declaration of the Right to Nature, preserving nature and Mother Earth and so forth. I mean, they do have that. And this certainly Chevron was not preserving the rights of Mother Earth, but this is right in their constitution, that the necessity of protecting the rights of Mother Nature. So, I mean, that of course Chevron would say, oh, that's flaky, but at least that's some law. It's certainly in the Constitution.
Okay, so we're approaching our 8 p.m. Time here. Let's pass the floor back to Zoe. Zoe, do you want to close us off for the night?
Yeah, I'll just close by reminding everyone that you will be getting an email with the video from tonight. It should have my slides and some resources for you all wrapped up in that one email. So if you're looking for anything, it should be there, the link to the documentary and all that. And then I just want to extend a thank you to all of you for coming, and to Diane and Amar for planning this webinar in large portion, and also to 350 Mass for sponsoring alongside Mass Peace Action. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful night, and keep a lookout for that email.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And
Thank
Diane,
you.
that was great.
Night.
Good for you. You go, kids. Go.